Okay, this is sort of a partial video response. I'm responding to part of a video that was done by ShaneDK. Now, I'm a little late to the game on this one. He did this one a year ago or so, I'm not sure. Just now came across it, and I wanted to comment on it because I think it's a really poor analysis, at least from this perspective that I'm looking at this one component of his analysis. I just find it very poor, and I want to sort of point out where the error is. Well, he's challenging a couple of claims. He's challenging 2 or 3 claims about top marginal rates in taxes. He's sort of coming up against some ideas about recessions and that sort of thing. But what I want to talk about is how he is looking at the revenues as a percentage of GDP versus the changes in the top marginal rate. And he's come up with this graph, and I'll just let him introduce what he's saying here.
The green line, the one along the bottom, is income tax revenues as a percentage of GDP. Now, I want to be clear, once again, we're only looking at income tax since we're studying the effects of taxing the highest earners. If we had included revenues from other sources, the line would be higher up, but it would also be misleading. So the claim is we can get more revenues in by taxing the rich. Well, to begin with, it looks like this is exactly what happens. There's a surge in revenues in the late teens, early 20s to match a surge in the tax rate as our government paid debts incurred during World War I and also helped bail out the UK, and then it went down again. But notice it didn't go up again during the Great Depression. That didn't happen until World War II, when production for items for the war effort skyrocketed. And after that, it seems like revenues have hit something of a plateau. Although we had an initial surge up to 16%, it seems to more or less level off at around 11 to 13%. Occasionally you get it rising above or falling below those levels, but it doesn't last. It seems like no matter what you do, you cannot get sustained revenues beyond about 13%. Once again, we see by the data that taxing the rich just will not help here.
Okay, so that's his argument, and it appears to be reasonable at first if you just sort of take in what he's saying and look at the graph. But see, the problem here is that the only way that this sort of analysis really is rigid and makes real good sense is that if he's arguing with someone that makes the claim that if you make a change in the top marginal rate, then it's going to have the exact same change to the revenues as a percentage of GDP, right? In other words, he's making the mistake that it's not an absolute relationship. There's no, if you drop the top marginal rate by, say, from 71 to 60, then no one's predicting that it's going to have an effect on the percentage of revenues as a percentage of GDP by 11%. No one's claiming that. It's not an absolute relationship. It's a relative relationship. You just think of how much of a change that would require in growth of the economy. So, yeah, I don't think this is very rigid at all, and it is really a poor analysis. It's actually fair to say that it may not be consequential. You could make that argument, but if we create a different axis and we look at what's actually going on, you can see that it pretty much follows that when you raise the marginal rate, you get a raise in revenue as a percentage of GDP. And the opposite is also true. They pretty much follow along. There are a couple of exceptions to that, one being occurring in the 80s and one occurring in the first years of Bush's reign. So, and it is an interesting graph, and I'm not saying let's raise taxes on the rich because of this graph. I'm not making that argument. Now, what I find interesting is that what's going on after the 80s is when the federal government really started obtaining a lot of debt. And what it looks like to me is that we're experiencing all of this sort of multiplier effect in the economy, and then we're having these bubbles, and then you'll have what almost looks like a sinusoidal reaction going on in revenues as a percentage of GDP. So, yeah, I think in general you have to say that looking at this graph, the history of it is when you raise top marginal rates, you get a raise in GDP. When you drop the top marginal rates, you get a little drop in revenues as a percentage of GDP. I think I said GDP a second ago. Misspoke. And then the later history, though, might fly in the face of that. But I want to say that this value of revenues as a percentage of GDP is a little tricky, because there can be a lot of things that affect that. And I do think that there is a correlation between the recent history and how much debt the government is taking on. So I think the actual interesting story might have something to do with that in terms of revenues as a percentage of GDP. Now, what I would like to do, maybe at some later point, is to look at absolute dollars, look at energy costs, put all of these things into one larger analysis, and maybe that would be insightful. I hope so. So maybe I'll look at that at some time in the future. But yeah, this is really a terrible graph in terms of its comparison to revenues as a percentage of GDP and changes in the top marginal rate. You can't really look at that flat line and make any real conclusions about it, because no, it's not an absolute relationship, it's a relative relationship, and he really should know that. So anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening.